The First and Second World Wars had a defining impact on the development of international human rights. Nazi atrocities during the Second World War and the Holocaust in particular were primary drivers of the international consensus that eventually resulted in the establishment of the United Nations in 1945 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The world united in horror and condemnation of the indiscriminate violence, unprecedented brutality, and atrocities that characterized the Second World War. The post-war slogan was "Never again." Never again will the international community stand by and allow authoritarian governments commit gross human rights violations, genocides, and mass killings, ethnic cleansing, and other gross human rights violations against their own citizens or citizens of other nations. International human rights, as it developed in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, was the outcome of international efforts to institute mechanisms to prevent mass atrocities. In this class, we will be examining the ways in which the two world wars and the end of colonialism marked a new phase in the development of international human rights. Many human rights scholars believe that the world wars and post-war internationalism marked the origins of the modern human rights movement. The First World War, or the Great War, which broke out in 1914, was the first truly global war. The events that sparked the war were centered in Europe. The assassination of the Austrian Archduke and heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, by a Serbian nationalist in 1914 was the immediate spark that triggered the war in Europe. However, once the war started, it developed into a global conflict. The causes and consequences of the First World War are complex and varied, and we cannot exhaustively examine all of them in this class. It is important, however, to note that the main causes of the war were rooted in nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and the European alliance system, which pitted the allied nations of Serbia, Russia, France, Britain, and later the United States against the central powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and later the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. The First World War was a devastating conflict. The total number of military and civilian casualties were over 35 million. There were over 15 million deaths and 20 million wounded, ranking it among the deadliest conflicts in human history. As countries devoted more civilian effort to the war, the line between military and civilian in the battles became blurred. Poison gas was used indiscriminately, and mustard gas became one of the most devastating weapons of the war. Among the atrocities that defined the war was the Ottoman government's systematic extermination of over 1 million Armenians. By the war's end, 4 major imperial powers had been militarily and politically defeated and ceased to exist. These included the German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. The successor states of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires lost a great deal of territory, while German, Russian territories were dismantled. The map of Central Europe would be fundamentally redrawn into several smaller states. The tensions and conflicts arising from the First World War were exacerbated by the outbreak of political revolutions in Europe. The most prominent of these was the Russian Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which triggered the global spread of Marxist communist ideology around the world. For many anti-colonial activists in the global South still under European colonialism, Marxist socialism was an attractive political ideology in their liberation struggles for independence. A dominant theme in international politics at the end of the First World War in 1918 was the right to self-determination. In efforts to address the root causes of global conflicts after the First World War, some political leaders envisioned a new international world order where the rights of peoples to choose their own government would be recognized and protected. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States put forward the 14 points, a statement of principles for international peace. Wilson's 14-point peace plan aimed at ending the First World War and preventing future wars, and it was based on 3 core principles. First, eliminating practices that precipitated a war, such as trade barriers, interference with freedom of the seas, secret diplomacy, colonial tensions, and the arms race. Secondly, settling the problems of Europe through resolutions on territorial integrity, national boundaries, and ethnic nationalism. Thirdly, establishing the League of Nations to preserve peace in the future. The search for collective security led to the formation of the League of Nations. The hope among world leaders was that the League would resolve political tensions and disagreements between nations that could lead to war. However, the League of Nations failed largely in fulfilling this hope. While it was occasionally able to solve problems between small states, it could not solve big problems that involved big power geopolitical interests. For example, when Mussolini of Italy invaded the independent African country of Ethiopia in 1935, the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, appealed to the League to intervene against the aggression of Italy, but to no avail. Apart from its inability to effectively address international conflicts, the League of Nations was hampered by the refusal of the United States to join the organization despite the active role of President Woodrow Wilson in its formation. This was a consequence of the United States' post-war isolationist policy. The promising post-war international human rights agenda, anchored on the right to self-determination, was therefore not realized. However, the formation of other international organizations such as the International Labour Organization or ILO in 1919 as part of the League of Nations operation led to some important human rights developments. The International Labour Organization successfully convinced several countries to adopt an 8-hour workday and the 48-hour working week. It also worked to end child labor and increase the rights of women in the workplace. The International Labour Organization became an agency of the United Nations in 1946. The outbreak of the Second World War had even more profound impact on human rights. This war was even more global in its origins and consequences. Hitler's conquests in Europe and visions of a greater Germany pitted the Grand Alliance of Nations against the Axis powers. Like the First World War, the Second World War was also defined by atrocities committed by many sides of the conflict. The most prominent of these were Nazi atrocities and the Holocaust. The international community united in horror and condemnation of Nazi wartime atrocities, including the state-sanctioned extermination of millions of Jews and other minorities. Nazi atrocities during the Second World War, more than any other event, brought home the realization that international law and morality cannot be grounded on purely utilitarian, idealist, or positivist doctrine. Certain actions are wrong regardless of the social
or political or even cultural contexts. Certain rights are inalienable irrespective of the socio-political exigencies. These strengthened the idea that all human beings are entitled to some basic rights and that it was the duty of states, nation-states, and the international community to protect these rights. In another class, we will explore the direct and indirect impacts of genocides and other mass atrocities of the 20th century on the development of modern human rights movement.